So with that, I want to introduce our speakers today. Of course, we have our author, Eric Muller, who is the Dan K. Moore Distinguished Professor of Law in Jurisprudence and Ethics at the University of North Carolina School of Law. And also, of course, part of the NJAMP, the National Japanese American Memorial Foundation. Yes. I was going to look it up beforehand, and I wanted to make sure I got it right. But thank you so much to all of our NJAMP folks who are here today. And of course, we're also joined by Mia Yamamoto, who is a criminal defense attorney and the daughter of Elmer Yamamoto, who was a lawyer in the Poston concentration camp, who you'll hear a little bit more about. And she attended the University of California Los Angeles School of Law and has been a leader in the field of social justice, including working with JABA as well, of course. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic over to Eric. Thank you so much for being here today, and pass it over to you, Eric.
Can you hear me? Yes. Great. Well, hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here on this nice, cool Los Angeles October afternoon. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm always thrilled to come back to JANM. Over the course of my career, JANM has been so incredibly supportive of the work that I've done, and it's just, I feel so privileged to have the connection with JANM that I do. Joy, thank you for accepting the nudge from Koji and scheduling and working on bringing this to life. I wanted to mention just a couple of other quick things. One of them is that, as Joy said, we have board members from the National Japanese American Memorial Foundation here with us today. And I'm very appreciative that my colleagues on that organization are here to listen and hopefully ask some questions and engage. The other thing, of course, I want to thank Mia. It's one thing to listen to, you know, a white guy who was born in 1962 and whose story this is not. It's another thing to hear from people who are actual descendants of the people that I've been writing about. So really, really fortunate to get the insights from Mia. And the last thing I want to do before I start for good, and I like to do this when I speak, especially out here, none of the work that I've done would be possible without the very, very meaningful and cooperative relationships that I've been able to enjoy with the people who actually experienced this wartime injustice. And I know that there are several folks here in the audience today. We're lucky to have several folks who were in the camps and for whom what I'm describing as history was their own personal and family experiences. So to the former incarcerees that are here, if you would just wave, that would be great. We have quite a few here. So thank you so much for being here and for sharing so generously of yourselves and of this difficult story that you all experienced. Okay, let's see. Is this going to work? Yes. All right. So this is the book that I've just published back in the late spring. And it's a little bit different from the work that I've done in the past. And I especially with an audience here at JANM, I want to sort of just take a moment to explain what's different about it. In most of the work I've done over my career, I have really focused in on the stories and experiences of people who were imprisoned, trying to understand more deeply, initially the young men that decided to resist the military draft from within the camps, trying to understand the experiences of Japanese Americans who were put through the ringer of having their loyalty examined and questioned and determined by the government. And then, frankly, courtesy of Bacon Sakatani, learning about the magnificent color photographs that Bill Mambo took at the Heart Mountain concentration camp and having the chance to bring those images of everyday life out for the world to see. This book is different because while it takes place at 3 of the 10 concentration camps, and it is in a certain sense about those camps, ultimately it's not about Japanese Americans, not directly. This book is about the white lawyers who worked for the agency that ran these camps. What I'm interested in this book is, of course, obviously I'm deeply interested in the experiences of those who were imprisoned, but I'm especially interested in the question of what is it that leads people to participate in systems that they know or have every reason to know are unjust, which is a question that's asked very extensively in the context of European history. Right? I mean, there's an entire fields of history that study perpetrators of injustice, stretching, of course, all the way up to mass murder in the German context. We don't tend to think as much about the question of those, what is it that motivated people to participate in our systems of injustice? And that's really what I'm interested in this book, and I think these lawyers give us a nice chance to try to think that through a little bit. So, I like to start with this quote, which is actually from an American historian of Europe, Tim Snyder. And he says in his book, Bloodlands, that it's easy to sanctify policies or identities by the suffering of victims. It is less appealing, but more morally urgent to understand the actions of the perpetrators. And why is that? That's because we face moral danger in our lives, but the danger is not that we will become victims. I mean, we might, but that's not a moral danger. The moral danger, as he says, is that we might become a perpetrator or a bystander. So that's the argument of the book in the way, that we need to understand what it is that leads people to participate in these systems. The agency that ran the camps, this is obviously going to be well known to most in the audience here today, but the agency that ran the camps was the War Relocation Authority, or WRA. This is the office building where it was situated. This is Farragut Square in Washington, D.C., not far from the White House. So that building, it's called the Barr Building. It's still there. It still looks exactly like that. And so the agency was a wartime agency. It did not exist before the war. It was brought into being in March of 1942 expressly for the purpose of setting up and then running the permanent camps where Japanese Americans would be moved to in the end of the summer and into the fall of 1942. For Japanese Americans, the WRA was their jailers. They were the people who were running the camps in which they were incarcerated. It was the military that was policing the boundaries, not the WRA. The WRA was a civilian agency. But it's quite natural, I think, for Japanese Americans to think back on the WRA and think of them as some kind of villain, because, of course, they were responsible for running these places. The thing that it's really important to understand from a historian's perspective is that for all of its faults and all of its blemishes, and there were many, the WRA was the friendliest of all government agencies that had anything to do with Japanese. When I say friendliest, I mean the most benign in their attitudes about and towards Japanese Americans than any other organization, any other government body, federal or state at the time. It's a little hard for us to get our minds around the idea that these jailers, to use a word like benign in the context of the times, but there's a reason for that, and the reason is that they were New Dealers. The WRA's leadership all came from basically two places, two other government agencies. One of them was the Department of Agriculture, under its very, very progressive leader, Claude Wickard. And the other was what was then called the Office of Indian Affairs, under its progressive leader, John Collier. Now, you might think, oh my God, Office of Indian Affairs, how could that be? How would we ever use the word benign in speaking about American Indian policy? This was the one moment, the one period in American history in which Indian policy, as it was called at the time, was being made in a way that was even making an effort to be understanding of and supportive of Native American tribes, Native American languages, Native American land ownership, Native American culture, Native American governing bodies. It was called the Indian New Deal. And so the leadership of the WRA were all a bunch of progressives, again, in the context of their time. And so this is why the WRA was as it was, because it was not the Army, it was not the military, it was not the State Attorney General's office, it wasn't the police. It was a bunch of sort of idealistic progressives with a variety of visions for what these camps should be, but all of them at least somehow concerned with the well-being of the community that was imprisoned. This is no effort to paint the WRA as a bunch of angels. They weren't. But in context, they were the most progressive group that you would find. The book focuses in on chiefly three men, the lawyers at each of three of the camps. These lawyers were the ones that I chose were at Heart Mountain, up there in northwest Wyoming. And the first lawyer, the book really only covers the first year that these camps were open. And the lawyer at Heart Mountain at that time was a guy named Jerry Housel. Jerry Housel was a local boy. He had grown up in Wyoming. His wife was the daughter of the mayor of the adjacent town of Powell, Wyoming, a mayor who was not very friendly to the Japanese Americans at Heart Mountain. He intended to spend the rest of his career working as a lawyer in Wyoming, and he did very successfully. He was young. He was just, I don't know, maybe 8 years out of law school when he was placed in this very, very powerful position of being the top lawyer at what was in effect and called at the time a concentration camp, an American concentration camp. So that's Jerry Housel at Heart Mountain. The second lawyer I profile in the book is this guy. He was at the Gila River, so-called relocation center in far southern Arizona on the land of the Gila River Indian Reservation. Jim Terry was a bit older than Jerry Housel, and he was a good deal more experienced than Jerry Housel was. Jim Terry traced his lineage, actually his wife traced her lineage all the way back to the Mayflower, very much a kind of blue blood family from New York. Jim Terry had gone to the finest Ivy League schools for both college and law school. His father was a very well-known law professor at Columbia University. He became a prosecutor during Prohibition, tail end of Prohibition. Jim Terry was in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, going after mobsters and bootleggers and other colorful characters. And when he left the U.S. Attorney's Office as a prosecutor, he then went to a very, very tony Wall Street law firm where he became a partner. That was his background before he moved to Arizona to take the position as the project attorney at Gila River. Why did he move out there? He moved out there because he had severe lung issues, and his doctor said, you need to get to a dry, hot climate. So he left New York and moved to the Southwest to take this job. And then the last of the three lawyers that I profile was this guy here, Ted Haas. And he was over at the so-called Colorado River, better known as Poston concentration camp. His background was different yet again from the other two. Ted Haas was a fervent defender of the rights of minorities. He was essentially a kind of proto-civil rights lawyer of his day. He's a Jewish man from that very kind of radical Lower East Side of New York tradition, and very, very much committed to, within the paternalistic context of his times, trying to help the lives and the legal fortunes of American minority groups, of which, of course, he was a member as a Jewish man. You know, he was not going to go to any big Wall Street law firm at the time that he graduated from Columbia Law School, because those firms were not hiring Jews at the time. So he felt this very strong sense of identification with minority groups. He came to the WRA from the Office of Indian Affairs and was, in fact, the number 2 man in the legal department there under a guy named Felix Cohen. Felix Cohen was the legal architect of the Indian New Deal. He was the legal innovator of trying to restore tribal sovereignty, trying to undo the decades and decades of repressive, even, in a certain sense, genocidal policies that the American government had pursued towards Native Americans. So 3 very different people from very different backgrounds with very different agendas. The job that they held down was called the Office of the Project Attorney. Each of the camps in WRA language was called a project. So they were the project attorney. And they had a really, really weird job. Those of you in the audience who are lawyers are going to have one of those kind of cartoon, like Scooby-Doo, kind of moments when I tell you what they did. Because as the WRA itself described the job, the project attorney's role was the combined one of government lawyer, city attorney, and private attorney to an evacuee population of between 5,000 and 17,000 people. So just let that sink in for a moment. They're employed by the US government. Their boss is the head of the War Relocation Authority, ultimately in Washington, D.C., at Farragut Square, the Bar Building. And part of what they're required to do is to give legal advice to the camp director, the project director, as they were called, and other functionaries within the camp administration system, where they were advising those individuals on all manner of things, but including a lot of social control, trying to control the prisoner population. They were also responsible for trying to work with Japanese Americans to help them with any legal issues that organizations that the prisoners created would have. So if they wanted to create a network of stores within the camp, that would have to be incorporated under the laws of the state. And it was the project attorney who would be responsible for working with the leadership of the community enterprises on their tax returns, on all of these different kinds of legal problems. And most interestingly, they also ran what was in effect a legal aid office for the prisoners. So if a prisoner needed a divorce, they would go to the project attorney's office and get legal advice from the project attorney. If there were custody disputes, if there were criminal matters, if there were property matters, especially if Japanese Americans in these camps were trying to hang on to the property that they had left behind in California and Washington and Oregon, they would go seek the help of the project attorney to represent their interests against the Californians and others that were trying to effectively steal Japanese Americans' properties. So I think you can kind of see this is a ridiculous conflict, right? On the one hand, you're representing the jailer, and on the other hand, you're representing the jailed. And that's why the book is called Lawyer, Jailer, Ally, Foe. They were, from moment to moment, and each of those roles. A typical day could involve counseling the project director about how to quell a labor strike by prisoners, and then turn around and bring a Japanese American into the office to try to help them recover money for their bank account back in California. Exquisitely conflicted job. And what that meant was, let me just say, it's also very important to note that all of the lawyers that I write about in this book knew that the system that they were serving was at a minimum unnecessary, was unjust, and might have even been illegal. They all believed that, all of them. Jim Terry, for example, at the Gila River Relocation Center, in his final report on his office's work, he said that the WRA had largely failed in what should have been its major objective, which was, he said, to demonstrate, at least as far as the agency was concerned, how a minority racial group could and should be dealt with in accordance with the highest democratic ideals and constitutional principles of which our nation boasts. He was saying that his agency had failed in that task, something that he very much regretted. He said in another passage, that it was not a clear and absolute necessity from the outset, this whole program, and therefore unnecessarily caused immeasurable and irreparable suffering, hardship, and loss to the minds, bodies, and properties of those who fell within its scope. And so perhaps from these quotes you can see the formation of a real moral and ethical dilemma for these lawyers. Men who were themselves progressives in the context of their time, who could see the wrongfulness of the task that they were helping to perform, and who nonetheless showed up for work every day and continued to do so. Being in a job like this raised questions that either they had to think about or suppress every day. Questions like, should I quit? Why am I doing this? Would it be better if I were just to leave this job? Or should I stay in it? Who is my client? Who am I actually working for here from moment to moment? Is my client the government? Is my client the prisoners? Who am I serving? What's my role? Nothing like the job of an American concentration camp lawyer had ever existed before. There were no rules. There was no job definition to speak of. So they were kind of making it up as they went along, and they were doing it far out of the sight and supervision of their boss in Washington. So every day was a new day where they were trying to figure out what it was they were supposed to be doing. And relatedly, they were always having either, again, to confront or suppress the question of, what are the boundaries of my discretion in this job? How much can I do to honor my conviction that this place is a bad place, an unnecessary place, an unjust place? How much can I do to further that view and still be doing the job that I was hired to do? These are the kinds of questions that they were struggling with. You might think that it would be pretty much impossible to get into the minds of these men. They were not famous lawyers. Nobody clamored for their oral histories after they finished these jobs. They left behind no later memoirs. They were not the subject of documentary films. So you might think that their experiences would be pretty much out of reach. But in truth, they are not out of reach at all, because their boss in Washington required them every 2 weeks to write back to Washington and to all of the other 9 lawyers at the other 9 camps a comprehensive report on everything they were doing, what they were seeing, what they were hearing, not just how many wills they prepared, but what were the knotty, thorny legal problems that came up when an incarcerated person from California needed a divorce, and the marriage was in California, but now they're in Arizona. And would an Arizona divorce have effect in California? These kinds of questions, right? And also, the lawyers did what they were asked to do. They wrote, every 2 weeks, they wrote letters that were at least 3 single-spaced pages long, and often they went to 8, 9, 10 single-spaced pages, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of correspondence in which these men were detailing what they were seeing, what they were hearing, what they were doing, the problems they were encountering. And some of them really became almost, you might say, diaristic in the way that they approached this, sharing not just outward things, but inward things, their reactions to what they were seeing. They would share vignettes that touched them in day-to-day life, or that they found humorous, or that they found sad. So there's this extraordinary trove of their own voices that's available to historians. And so it's through those, chiefly through those letters, that I was able to try to imagine my way inside the heads and to try to speak in the voices of these lawyers. Just to give you an example of the kinds of sometimes mundane problems that would come across the desks of these lawyers, I'll share an example that took place at both Heart Mountain and Poston. And it was the issue of fencing. So when prisoners got to Heart Mountain and Poston, there was a fence around the broad perimeter of the camp, which was huge. But there was no fence inside around the residential area. The Army decided that they wanted to put up a fence right in the faces of the prisoners, like this fence that you see here in this photograph by Bill Mambo at the Heart Mountain camp. This fence did not exist when they got there, and you can see that it ended up there, and you can see how close it was to the residential areas. I mean, this was an in-your-face symbol of the government's belief that you are dangerous and not to be trusted. The issue came before the lawyers at both of Heart Mountain and Poston. At Heart Mountain, Jerry Housel learns that the Army wants to put up this fence. He knows that it's not a good idea. He knows that it's going to be a provocation to the prisoners. His reaction is to say, I looked through the regulations and I didn't see anything that would prohibit the installation of a fence here. And so he writes to his boss in Washington. So, my advice was that the fence can go up. Let me know if I'm wrong about that. Very passive. Same precise issue comes before Ted Haas at Poston. His reaction is to draft and circulate a petition among his fellow WRA employees objecting to the fence, trying to get the staff of the WRA at Poston to speak out to the Army against the installation of the fence. Ultimately, he was unsuccessful with that petition. The fence went up. But the point here is to see how two lawyers can be presented with precisely the same issue at almost exactly the same time, and both of them, acting within their role, decide to do very different things. This is, I think, a great illustration of that question of discretion. Jerry Housel could have circulated a petition if he had wanted to, but it didn't occur to him to do that because he conceived of his role differently. Another example that I think shows this conflict of interest problem really, really poignantly. This is actually, the photograph is a photograph of Heart Mountain, but the event itself took place at Gila River in southern Arizona with Jim Terry as the project attorney, our tough-as-nails prosecutor. He reports that One day, he was sitting in his office, and a young man came in and told him that his mother, a young Nisei came in, said that his mother, his Issei mother, had been out early in the morning for her morning walk, which she would do every morning. At that time, in that place, at that hour of day, it was still quite dark out. It was like 6:30 in the morning or 7 in the morning or something. And lo and behold, the WRA had hired a contractor to install some kind of tanks in the ground. And the contractor the day before had dug a 6-foot deep, 8-foot wide pit and then left for the night. No fence, no lights, no signs. And so Mrs. Sato plunged. She was walking. She didn't see that there was a gaping hole in the ground. She plunged into the hole and suffered a double fracture of her pelvis. The son then goes to the project attorney's office. He wants to know what the family's rights are. He wants to know if maybe they can sue. And so you're Jim Terry, you're the project attorney. Who's going to be the defendant in this lawsuit? The company that dug the hole, but also the WRA, right? I mean, the government is going to be potentially sued. They want to know what their rights are, the sons. And so Jim Terry has this very challenging moment where, well, what do I tell him? And so he sort of waffles. He says, you know what? You should not be worrying about a lawsuit right now. You should be worrying about your mom. Wait until make sure she gets back to full health. We'll notify the contractor that this happened. Maybe we'll send somebody out to take a picture. But there's a 2-year statute of limitations on a personal injury claim that you might have. So, don't worry about it. And then he says to the boss in Washington, in a case like this, should I counsel them as I've done, or because of the possibility of a claim against the WRA, however remote, just suggest securing private legal advice if they believe a cause of action exists. They should secure legal advice as a Japanese American in a concentration camp on an Indian reservation in southern Arizona, several hours away from the nearest city, Phoenix, as a Japanese American while the United States is at war with Japan. They're supposed to find a lawyer to advise them about whether they might have a cause of action against the WRA. So again, constant dilemmas. Who do I represent? How should I be doing this job that I'm doing? There's another thing that this book does that I think is of special interest to the Japanese American community and the Japanese American readership. This is something that I don't typically talk about when I talk about the book to law firms or other non-Japanese American audiences. But this book opens up a window on aspects of life in the camps that tend not to be remembered, tend not to be part of the oral histories that Japanese Americans have given, tend maybe not to be forgotten, because the lawyers were encountering Japanese Americans in the context of the legal problems they were having. That was their point of access. They were helping Japanese Americans run the judicial commissions that processed petty offenses and misdemeanor crimes that happened in the camps. They were helping Japanese Americans if there was an insanity case in a family. There would need to be arrangements made for that person to be taken to a state hospital. It was the attorneys that were involved in that. If there was a marital dispute, it was the attorneys. Now, these are things that are not really, we don't know much about these harder aspects of life in camp, and it's obvious why. I mean, when you sit down for an oral history, nobody sits down for an oral history and says, ah, yes, Poston, that's the place I was busted for shoplifting, right? Nobody would say that. But through the letters of these lawyers, we can see some of these more difficult aspects of life in camp. As, for example, what you see on the screen here. This was a Heart Mountain issue. Virgil Payne, who was the head of the kind of social welfare office, brought in another triangular affair, of which there were a surprising number, at least surprising to me. The husband is working in the southern part of Wyoming, and his wife and children are living here in the center. Cousins of the wife have been objecting strenuously to the attentions and the devotions paid to her and the children by one Mr. K. K claims he was merely helping out the family at the request of the woman who wanted someone to look after the kids when she was attending classes. But the cousins say that they went over there several times to do some stuff around the house, the barracks, and each time they had found Mr. K there in a very home-like appearance and atmosphere. Again, this is not, generally speaking, people don't talk about marital infidelity when they sit down to give an oral history. But these letters are very, very useful as a window, admittedly, the window of a white man's eyes, but windows onto aspects of camp life that I think Japanese American readers would find quite informative. I certainly did. The last thing I want to say about the book is the way I wrote it. This is not a conventional academic history. This book reads much more like a novel than it does like a history book. It's not a novel. It's not truly a novel. If it were a novel, it would be much more interesting because there would be love affairs and there would be murders and there would be all of the things that happen in novels. Everything in the book that you read, all of the major events are things that actually happened. And there's a section at the back that documents where the source was for the things that I'm describing. But I decided that because what I'm interested in is what led them internally to keep going or ultimately to decide to leave, as two of them did. What was their inner experience like? And I'm interested in that not just for historical reasons, but because the dilemmas that they faced are kinds of dilemmas that many people face at different points in their lives. Admittedly, not as a lawyer running a concentration camp, but we all, in one way or another, at some point in our lives, might be involved with, somehow at the fringes of, or maybe even at the center of some kind of project that just does not feel right. And how we deal with our discretion, with understanding what our roles are, with understanding who we want to be when we are in these morally conflicted situations. The best way to do that I know was to try to understand what was capable of being understood about the inner lives of these lawyers. And so I very much believe in Hannah Arendt's comment from a book review she wrote in 1968, where she said that storytelling reveals meaning without making the mistake of defining it. The book does not preach. The book does not say these lawyers did good or these lawyers did bad. The book tells their stories and invites you to make meaning of the decisions they made, of the actions they took, thereby not just asking yourself, what did they do and why, but what would I have done if I had been in this position? How would I have taken a job like this? If I had taken it, how would I have carried it out? It's only if we think, we like to say, injustice like Japanese American incarceration should never happen again to anyone. And of course we all believe that. But the only way we can make sure it doesn't happen again is to understand why it happens. and especially to understand how it's not moral monsters that are running, mostly, not moral monsters that are running these systems. There's a handful, certainly, names that we know, DeWitt, Benditson. There are some pretty bad folks involved in the creation of this system. But running it day to day was not moral monsters. It was ordinary people like Jim Terry and Ted Haas and Jerry Housel, whose energies were essential to the continued operation of this unjust system. I want to end and transition to Mia with this photograph. This is the legal staff, the non-white legal staff of Camp Number 1 at Poston. All of these men are lawyers, Nisei attorneys. The one whose name is most famous is over here on the right. That's Saburo Kido, who was the very, very prominent JACL leader at that time. This is the lawyer about whom I write most in the book, Thomas Masuda. Thomas Masuda appears as a prominent character in the book because there was a period of time when Ted Haas, so weighed down by the trauma unfolding all around him, got very, very ill, and in fact had to leave camp for several months to come here to Los Angeles for surgery and then a lengthy convalescence. He lobbied hard for Thomas Masuda taking his job while he was away. So, oddity of oddities, for several months, the government lawyer at the Poston concentration camp was a Japanese-American lawyer, Thomas Masuda, and he had to write letters back to Washington just like the others did. So there are a sizable handful of his letters that gave me a little bit of comfort in trying to depict him. I guess I would just say depict him. And then there's this fellow here on the second from the right. This is another of the Nisei lawyers at Poston. This is Elmer Yamamoto. Elmer Yamamoto was the father of Mia Yamamoto. And so we are fortunate that we get to hear now, not just from somebody who read these letters and for whom this is history, but somebody for whom, an attorney, I might note, for whom this is family lore, family history, personal history. So at this point, I want to thank you for listening to me, and then turn things over to Mia for maybe a different perspective on this topic.
Thank you, Professor Muller. Appreciate it. Thank you for writing the book. Thank you for all your work that went into and the detailed and elaborate scholarship that went into it. It is a very readable book. I might say that I appreciated as much the accounts of what was happening in the first 2 years of my life in Poston, because I have no recollection independently myself. But I did hear a lot about camp. Certainly not from my dad, who never said anything about camp. And my dad died before he ever really said anything to me, actually. So I never really got an account for it. Most of what I heard was from my mom. And she talked a lot about how the conflicts in camp, some of it came down to between the Issei and the citizen Japanese Americans who at some point were seen by the Issei as getting thrown under the bus for the advantage of the citizens, and the divisiveness that was taking place there was to some extent encouraged and exacerbated by some of the institutional organizations that existed there. And it had to do a lot with the mandate. These lawyers, and I had to say, I had to put myself in their shoes, and it was really hard to try to figure out what I would do under those circumstances. Because I know that I grew up angry about the camps. I grew up just absolutely seething about what had been done. It just seemed so disproportionate and really, in a very real sense, terroristic, in that you select out certain people. And I guess it isn't until you're somewhat educated that you sort of see the parallels, not just with the Holocaust, but with the Belgian concentration camps, with the same concentration camps in the Philippines. And the wartime use of the word diminishing and being replaced by the euphemisms like relocation that were being used to try to distinguish themselves from, and they were distinguishable from the death camps of Germany and Europe. But if you examine the interplay between the inmates and the lawyers, there's that dilemma. There's that moral dilemma. I am the lawyer. I'm going to try to get you a divorce, or I'm trying to get you rightfully get your property back that you rightfully own and should have. And yet, the same mandate from the WRA was to somehow discourage and hopefully eradicate certain elements of culture that would somehow be more indicative of a loyalty to Japan as opposed to America. And what was, I thought, most egregious personally was the cross-examination of that poor Mr. Kira by Jim Terry, obviously a very skilled attorney, a very skilled prosecutor. He even had that kind of style, inquisitorial and completely presumptive of your guilt and just absolutely, from my point of view, it's effective on one level because it ended up really blowing this poor kid's mind. And if he wasn't mentally ill before that interview, he was certainly mentally ill afterwards, after which he sometime later decides to walk out of camp saying he's the president and ends up getting shot by the guards. But the abuse he took during that transcript, during that interrogation, just had me infuriated. I was sitting there thinking every answer he gave that Terry obviously discounted as self-serving somehow was exactly the same answers I would have given. And given what people know about me in terms of speaking even more frankly about it, I think I would have been in this gentleman's face really bad. Of course I would have failed. And it was kind of interesting because my dad was a rebel. We actually went down to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. to see what the informants had been saying about him. And they were saying things like, this guy's a troublemaker. We even suspect he might be an agent of Japan. My dad never even visited Japan. He was born in Hawaii. But the main thing was my dad was so amazingly loyal to the country, though. Even though he had a bad leg, he tried to join the army, and he was very much a patriot, but he very much objected to the incarceration. He very much objected to the camps. He agitated against them. And the one thing that everybody told me about my dad when I would ask about him, he said, your dad was for the Issei because nobody else was for them. And he could speak their language. He could speak Japanese. And he could advocate for them. And believe me, the citizen group really didn't like what he was saying. And he was saying things like, no, we have to have them and include them in our decision-making and our membership. And the people in the citizens group were against that. And they wanted to make sure that they were distinguishing themselves from the Issei. The whole thing about loyalty, asking an Issei person to renounce their loyalty to Japan, their citizenship, that would end up making them people without a country. They couldn't be citizens of America because you had to be born here. There was a prohibition against Asian American citizenship, Japanese American in particular. And so the questions that were being asked to poor Mr. Kira in the book, in the transcript, I think is one of the most striking elements because it's a true documented interrogation of a subject. And if you look at it, there's very few of us today who would have not said the same exact things as this young man did, who was basically, he lost what he could have had because of his interview, because of his truth. And it was part of the book that absolutely wanted to get up and hit somebody. Even though Mr. Terry, I will say this, given his credit, he was a good lawyer. And when he would take on a case for somebody in the camp, a Japanese American, didn't matter, he would do a good job. So he was at least that much of a lawyer insofar as him being loyal to his client, because that's all I know. The government. I was a public defender. I'm a criminal defense attorney. The government is invariably, when I go to court, they're my enemy, and I'm not there to help them. I'm there to beat them all up and down if I have to. But the main thing is this: I know who I'm loyal to, and that's what really, absolutely, it challenged me that way. Because I started putting myself in their shoes and thinking, Jesus, what would I do? And I knew what I would do. And I would end up in the jail with everybody else. I'd end up in Thule. I know where I would end up because I was even more extreme than my dad, believe me. So knowing what I know now about the situation, the rivalries between the groups that were like blindly loyal to the incarceration, and people like my dad that didn't like it, that objected to it, that spoke out against it, that brought petitions, everything else against it, people ended up getting hurt. In the book, there's a vignette about poor Saburo Kido there getting attacked and beat up, and apparently it was a regular thing. People that objected to his accommodationist and collaborationist demands and advocacy would react in violence. And I remember the first time he got beat up, my mom talked about it. She said, oh yeah, I said, they threw a blanket over his head and beat him up pretty good out there. And they didn't know who did it. The first few attacks, they didn't know. But she said the group that claimed responsibility for it was a group called the Exclusive 20s. I remember laughing and thinking, wow, that's like the Crips and the Bloods. It's kind of like you end up putting these little violent groups together for the purpose of whatever. But the reality of it, for instance, reading that in the book and thinking, wow, I know all about that struggle. My dad actually ran against Saburo Kido, and because of that, they blamed the first attack on my dad. My dad, that's ridiculous. You know, he would never have done anything like that or had anything to do with anything like that. But his advocacy was extraordinarily, from my point of view, extraordinarily law-abiding, because that was one of the things that he felt very strongly about it. So whatever you do, you got to abide by the law. You can protest it, you can get out and object to it, and do whatever you can, but you've got to abide by it. And so he never would have been involved with that. But I will say this: I really appreciated getting some idea about what it was like to live, not just in a law office during that period of time, what was going on in there, but it really shone a light on the people going through what they were going through, and the idea that the things they were going through, because I've only studied that stuff in law school. I mean, I never got involved with Dale Minam, dealing with the Korematsu cases and all of that. So I've only been on the edges of it in terms of my own examination or my inquiry into the situation. And this book really shined a light not just on the folks, the older folks, really, the Nisei and Issei, who were there, but some of the young people, like that poor 21-year-old person who I identified with really strongly, because I kept thinking about the people that went in the military. Now, it talks a little bit about the 442 and all that sort of, but my family, my mom, felt as though the 442 vindicated the image of the Japanese Americans as loyal citizens who are willing to sacrifice for their country, sacrifice their lives for their country, in an even disproportionate way. And I think there's no question but that, no matter how much I hated the internment, no matter how angry I was at the government, I still had to go into the military when it was time for me to go. When I graduated college, I did something I know people don't notice this. We used to be able to push your draft. You got to be of my generation to even understand that. But you'd be able to volunteer for the draft. That way you could just go in when you wanted to and come out after 2 years, which was, I figured about as much as I really want to put up with that. But the main thing was I really felt a very strong obligation to prove myself to my community, to the Japanese American community, more than just American society, that I was one of us, that I was patriotic, and that at the time it would have gone down, I would have joined the 442 and done whatever I had to do. And I remember my mom telling me, my mom was a really good person, but she told me, she said, I would rather you came home dead than came home a coward. And a lot of that came from a lot of the Japanese American tradition and the inspiration, both positive and negative, of the 442 and the 100th Infantry. That example that was put out there is in many ways a very, very strong beacon for you to follow if you feel like you're trying to prove yourself. And I guess just at that point, closeted transgender person, I felt in a lot of ways that I had to prove myself in a whole lot of different avenues, and to go in and do that. But let me just say the resonance, and this is what I'm going to say, because I feel like the one thing I wanted to say was that Pearl Harbor caused this country to lose its way, to absolutely go around the Constitution, allow the military to dictate what we could do, and not the conscience, not the principles, not the rules that we have normally lived by. We let war, we let Pearl Harbor. And I look at this and I see what's going on after 9/11 and the targeting of Muslim and Arab people. And I'm telling you that we studied what was going on. I want to recommend one movie to you. I know it's watch a book and all, but The Mauritanian talks about Mohamedou Salahi, who was taken into Guantanamo in the wake of 9/11 and didn't get out to 2014. And he was brutally terrorized and tortured in Guantanamo. And he told his story, not just in The Mauritanian, which is a cool movie, by the way. Jodie Foster plays Nancy Honda, who was his lawyer for 14 years. And Benedict Cumberbatch plays an honest and principled prosecutor. Thank goodness. There are some of those around, you know what I mean? And he did not proceed with the prosecution once they realized that he had been tortured and everything he said was complete bullshit. Sorry, I'll cut this off. But that same kind of attitude allows for a lawlessness. And I blame people like Jay Bybee and John Yoo and the people that justify torture for the purpose of gaining information. I don't believe it ever did any good, and it harms us morally. Let me just say that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mia. I believe there's time for questions and reactions and comments from the audience, but I would actually like to start by asking you a question, Mia, if I might. I'm curious to know, you've had obviously a very distinguished distinguished career fighting for the rights of criminal defendants. I'm curious to know to what extent you feel that your dad's status as a lawyer and whatever the family legacy, the impact of their experiences, and yours, of course, as a very young person, had on your decision to become a lawyer and how you wanted to be as a professional.
Well, my dad,
Grab it.
yeah, my dad's example, my dad's example was as a community lawyer. He was somebody that cared about his community and his society. He knew that they needed defense. They needed somebody to stand up for them and go into the court for them and argue against the government for them. So I think being born in the camp and having a dad who was a troublemaker was an important factor in the sort of the arc of my career. I started off always saying that when I got out of school, I said, I'm going to fight for the poor, man. The poor never get a fair shake. I'm going to be a legal aid lawyer. And that's the first job I did. And then after 3 years, I decided that was not for me. And I became a public defender. And again, I've been doing public defense. I've been fighting for poor people. And the good thing I never thought I wanted to be a criminal lawyer. You know, I know you teach criminal procedure, and I actually got a high grade in that class. But I remember thinking at the time, I'm this really smart person, and why would I give my best to the worst people in the world? But you know, I go into court when I'm a public defender, and it's the same people. They just got different legal problems. I'm still fighting for the poor, and in many ways, they need me more there than they need me over there at legal aid, because it's way more immediate. You might be going straight to jail. They might be trying to take your life. This stuff is really, really immediate. And so I found my place there, and I felt like the tradition of my dad, I like to think he died when I was too young to even think about that type of thing. But just as an aside, he had his office right down there first in San Pedro, over at the San Pedro Firm Building, right on the second floor. He used to look down at the courtyard. When I was a kid, I visited his office a lot because my mom had to drop me off there. My dad had a bad leg, so he couldn't drive, so she drove him every place. So I remember, what does a lawyer do, right? Some person comes in the office, he looks really worried, and he's looking at these papers and stuff. And then my dad comes out, he's really happy. He's go inside. They do all this bowing stuff, right? The old school of Japanese. In any event, the guy comes out, and he's happy, or he's relieved, or something. And he walks out, and I'm like in the 5th grade or whatever when I'm watching this. I take it back. Yeah, because he died when I was in the 8th grade. But the main thing was I remember seeing him looking back in that room and just saying, what's he got back there? You know? It's all a bunch of books, a bunch of books. I'm thinking, so he must be a therapist. He makes people feel better. They got problems, and he makes them feel better. So I thought, I can be a lawyer. I always like helping people, making them feel better if I could. So that was what my initial impetus was. But when I started the practice, I started to realize that, criminal defense, that's where I belong. That's where I need to be, the lawyer for the damned. I feel like that's That's always going to be my identity in many ways, and I'm happy with it. Let me put it to you that way. That's what I was probably meant to be.
Thanks. If only more people saw lawyers as people who make people feel better, we would. So what's the plan at this point? Shall we open things up? Okay, there's a mic here, so I can't really see.
Hi, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much. Eric, you mentioned kind of almost in passing that 2 out of the 3 left. Were they the more progressive ones? Did they get fed up? What's the circumstances behind that?
Well, it won't surprise you that the one who didn't leave was tough as nails Jim Terry. In fact, he was the only lawyer for the War Relocation Authority who served at a camp from the day one to the very day, the day the gates closed. He was there the whole time. The others left. Jerry Housel left because, well, he went into the service. He went into the Navy. But it's very clear from the correspondence that he left behind that he decided to do that because he was becoming very afraid that there was going to be an incident at Heart Mountain, kind of like the ones at Poston and Manzanar, that there was going to be violence and bloodshed. And I think he just did not want to be he didn't want to be there for that. And so that's when he decided to enlist. Ted Haas, the guy at Poston, I think would have stayed, but he was given the opportunity to go back to a very important job in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, running one of their regional offices, and so he left to take the better opportunity, as it were. But he says in his final letter, he says, I am leaving one great American minority to go fight for the rights of another great American minority, speaking of Japanese Americans and Native Americans. So that's why they left.
Hi, thank you. I echo Gil's thanks for this. This is a great presentation, and I appreciate the stories. I also wanted to say I appreciate that you're putting it in context. I think it's really easy to look back from now and post-civil rights era and judge the actions of others back then when it was an entire different situation. My question is this. What surprised you when you were doing your research?
I say in the preface to the book, I actually met one of these guys. I met Jerry Housel. Jim Terry and Ted Haas Jim Terry passed away in the 1970s. Ted Haas died in the 1950s, the late 1950s. Jerry Housel was still around when I was on the faculty at the University of Wyoming College of Law. It was my first teaching job. And one day, I had just started to study this stuff. I knew virtually nothing. And the dean of the law school came up to me knowing that I was interested in this and said, Jerry Housel's going to be here for some Wyoming Bar Association meeting here in Laramie. He was the lawyer up there at Heart Mountain. You might want to interview him. And my first thought, I was just like, what do you mean he was the lawyer at Heart Mountain? Why would there have been a lawyer? In my mind, the only role for a lawyer in this whole context would be to fight this whole system. To me, a lawyer in an American concentration camp is like having a rescue squad at an execution. It's just that's not what they're there for. It didn't make any sense. So I think the biggest surprise for me was the trajectory of going from believing that these guys were almost by definition doing wrong to seeing that their position was much, much more complicated than that. And that painting history in black and white does a very bad job of actually capturing the realities of what people's experiences were. I went from thinking that these men had no business doing this job to thinking that in many ways it was good that if these camps were going to exist, that there were people like at least a couple of these, not so much Jim Terry, but there were people like these guys who were willing to step in and try as best they could to find spots where they could exercise their conscience rather than just making the lives of Japanese Americans more bitter.
I just have a couple of comments. One, you mentioned WRA as being benign, and I'd like to reflect on that by saying that they did everything they could to normalize our existence in the camps. There's beauty parlors, barber shops, we had a recreation department. Our high school football field was flooded in the wintertime and made it an ice skating rink. And all these things, we had block managers, and they met in like a city council, and I think they transmitted their concerns to the administration, and so as I say, everything is normalized. The other comment I want to make is, until today, it never occurred to me that there are lawyers among the evacuees. Now, my question is, why didn't they sue the federal government for this evacuation? Sue EO 9066 to begin with. So if they had won, nothing would have happened.
The lawsuits were actually brought, and petitions were brought, and a lot of things were brought, but they were summarily denied at the beginning. People did bring lawsuits out of the camps. People objected to that and tried to do petition writing sorts of organizing things against the camps and against the incarceration. They didn't go very far. And by the time that the Korematsu cases, Hirabayashi, those cases went to the Supreme Court, if you notice, they all lost too. There were a number of actions that were taken that were dismissed at the beginning. And the only ones that got as far as they got, we lost. So it wasn't like people didn't fight. It's just that we took on something that was pretty much it was pretty much rigged against us.
Yeah, I would add, Mike, that I came through this project with a lot of empathy for people like Mia's dad and Thomas Masuda, the one in the middle of that group. Just if you think for a moment about the position that they were in, these were American citizens. They had gone to American law schools and graduated and had then had practices of law before they were incarcerated. And then they find themselves locked up in a system that they can see is bad and unnecessary and, again, probably illegal. But what would we expect of them in that situation? I mean, I think it's easy for me to say, gosh, I wish they would have just thrown down the gauntlet and filed lawsuit after lawsuit and fought and fought. I don't know, though. I mean, the community was so beleaguered and so vulnerable and so dependent on the goodwill, such as it was, of the WRA. The prisoners knew that if the WRA wasn't running the camps, it would have been the Army running the camps, and they would have been miserable. So I think that question of, well, what should a Nisei lawyer do during that time is a very difficult one. I think in some ways they were probably asking themselves versions of the questions that the white lawyers were asking. Is it better for me to join this project attorney's office and use my legal skills to try to help this community? Or is it better for me to not have anything to do with this and not, in a sense, collaborate with our oppressor? So I just think it's a great question. I love the question, but I do think it kind of opens a window on how complex their situation was as well. In some ways, more complex than it was for the government lawyers.
Thank you, Eric. I just wanted to say, growing up, I remember kind of confronting our elders and saying, why didn't you resist? Why did you even get on the trains? Why did you do that? And the answer was, at least my mom said, they had guns. What were they going to do? You know what I mean? I had kids. I needed to get on that train. I mean, I wasn't going to abandon my family. And people knew that if they just didn't get on the trains or whatever, they were going to shoot them. And they had certainly told them that before. So I do understand it. But I mean, I think you ask questions about why people got on the trains to Auschwitz. There is a sort of there's a terror that exists when you're being herded up, rounded up, and taken away, that anybody who stands out in a way is in big danger. And we know from the history of the way people were treated here by Ashi. People that decided to resist the curfew, resist the whole relocation, they were sent to prison. And I guess that was your choice, one prison or another, in a way. So I don't really know that I was too stupid when I was young to really understand context, historical context, because it was way different for my parents than it is for me. Definitely, the world that I live in, my world that exists now, would have supported my resistance. That world then, the whole Japanese community was trying so hard to be a part of America and to try to show that they were a part of America and they were going to go along with what America wanted at that time. Certainly that's foreign to the rest of us here, but at that time it was a very real thing. So I do understand it. I feel like I've got some compassion for it, and a lot more than I did at the time.
I'll just say one more thing. I know there's another question, but the research project that I'm working on right now is actually a really lovely coda to this book. I'm looking at a law that was passed in the late 1940s called the Japanese Evacuation Claims Act, which set up a system that allowed Japanese Americans to seek reparations of a certain kind for property that they had lost as a consequence of their so-called evacuation. The reason that there's a kind of it's a coda to this is that the lawyers who were filing all of the claims against the government after the war were these guys. These guys all went back they opened up private practices, and when the opportunity came in 1948 and 1949 to help the community try to get some kind of compensation, these were the lawyers who were handling most of the cases.
Professor Muller, one of the answers you gave, you said you feel like it was maybe good that these white lawyers were in the system as opposed to maybe the alternative. I'm wondering whether in the writings of any of the white lawyers or in your talking with Mr. Hassel, did any of them use that as their rationalization why they participated?
The rationalization being, it's better for me to
be doing this because I know that I'm progressive, and then if I leave and I for example, I think we said Jerry Hassel joined the Navy.
Right.
Was he worried that the guy that was going to replace him or women? In fact, were there not women
attorneys?
Yes.
There were at the very, very end in 1945. There were 2 women lawyers working for the WRA who went out for the last couple of months and helped to close a couple of the camps down. I didn't see any direct evidence of the lawyers writing. 'Cause remember, they were writing to their boss, right? So they were a little selective about what they would disclose and not disclose. I didn't see anybody saying, better I'm here than somebody who would come and replace me and be, hard as nails. But it's evidence, if you read between the lines, I think they're taking a certain kind of pride in their work, and I think that the pride that they take is related to what you're asking about, a feeling that at least they're there to fight a little bit for the property rights, and if they weren't there doing it, then who knows what they'd be replaced by.
Thank you.
There's one in the back, and then down here in the front as well.
Okay, I don't have a question, but what I want to say to both of you is thank you for what you did today and told us today. I've been a volunteer here at the Japanese American National Museum since May of 1994, and before I came here, I was ignorant about what happened to us. But I like to come to these things because when I come, I always learn something new. So I want to thank both of you for what you did, for your presentation today.
Thank you very much for being here. The microphone is making its way to you.
Thank you. Well, I want to echo this gentleman's thanks to the two of you and to the museum for the kind of programming it does. I'm wondering, were there Nisei lawyers at each of the camps who served on the legal staff?
Yes, actually, there were a couple of Nisei lawyers at Hart Mountain. I know there were some at Gila River. There were a couple at Rower. I can't say for sure that there was a Nisei lawyer in the office at every camp, but the project attorney's offices, by the way, also hired Japanese American accountants and insurance agents. You know, Japanese Americans had to pay income taxes from within these camps. And so there was a little, I know,
Yeah.
right? I know. But there were Nisei accountants who would help Japanese Americans with their taxes.
I mean, that raises so many questions about complicity. The camps could not have run without those services, really. So I'm wondering the extent to which there's been documentation about the roles of these people, some of their moral conflicts and dilemmas, and if in the correspondence with the main office by the lawyers, if there's any discussion at all about the relationship, objections made at certain times by the Nisei lawyers, if there's anything in the documents that reflects some of that.
There is evidence that the Nisei lawyers, Thomas Masuda, for example, who left letters behind, that he was able to bring the voice of the community into the WRA offices in a way that other people couldn't. He was able to help Ted Haas, his boss, understand that a particular outcome in a trial was something that the community favored and not to be concerned about it, just as an example. But I have to say the question that you're asking is extremely rich because there is, I think, a very, a bit of a cartoon-like depiction of the idea of those who resisted incarceration and then people like, JACL leaders who were seen as collaborating. I think there's a fascinating group in the middle of those two poles, and that's people like this, people who did decide to engage in some way with the WRA as an employer, and whose labors were essential to carrying the camp, into execution. Here's the thing, though. First of all, there's not a lot of direct evidence of their experiences. That's one problem that a historian has. I think this would be an extraordinary topic for a history, to look at professionals in the camps, Nisei professionals, and their dilemmas, and how they straddled the line between jailer and jailed. Fascinating. I don't think that I would be the right person to write that history, because I'm not Japanese American. I mean, I think that if there is a young Nisei historian out there somewhere, listen, or I should say Sansei or Gosei historian out there who's looking for a topic, this would be an exquisite topic to explore. So I hope that happens.
This is a little bit maybe unrelated. I have two questions. One is when my first question is Min Yasui. I'm from Denver, so I'm very familiar with Min Yasui and his experience. But did he serve as an attorney? Did he keep up his legal practice in camps? Because right out of camp, he applied for and was turned down in Colorado for the bar, and then he did it again 3 times, and then he became accepted and served as an attorney. and a civil rights icon in Denver. So that's one question, and also that he's hardly ever mentioned. When like Korematsu and Hirabayashi are mentioned, Min is hardly ever mentioned in that group. And also Ellen Endo, she's the one that won a case, but she didn't go to camp, right? So.
No, she did.
She did.
Mitsuya
Okay, yeah.
Endo, yeah, she was at Topaz.
Yeah. So it's curious to me that certain names are underplayed.
Yeah. So Min Yasui was at Minidoka, if I remember correctly, and I could go back and look. I do have the correspondence from that camp. I could look to see whether he actually ever joined the office or not. I don't think that he did. But I'm not certain. As for Mitsuya Endo, yes, she was at Topaz, and I know Ellen Endo as well, but that's a different person. So she was at Topaz, and she was actually offered the opportunity to leave camp by the WRA, so that it would basically to moot out her lawsuit, and she chose to stay in camp so that she could fight it out to the bitter end, and she was the one who was successful. Why do we not hear about Min Yasui and Mitsuya Endo? I don't think we hear about Min Yasui's case because his case was never decided on the merits by the Supreme Court. And then but during the time period, his case went to the Supreme Court, but they rejected it. They handled it on a technicality, what we would call a technicality, whereas Gordon Hirabayashi and Fred Korematsu both got full opinions from the Supreme Court. So I think that's one reason. I think a reason that we never really heard much about Mitsuya Endo is that she didn't seek the limelight. She really refused to be interviewed, as I understand it, across most of the rest of her life, and really just did not want the limelight in any way. So I think that's part of the reason as well.
I think we're pretty much at time. I wanted to offer if you all had any last comments or anything.
Just to repeat my gratitude to everybody for coming out and listening, and for these wonderful questions that you've asked. Thank you so much.
So I want to recommend you read the book. I read it, and I can tell you it does read really, it's a great page turner. It's not like some dry law professor's book. I read a lot of those, man, and I'm telling you, you don't want to do that for fun. But this one you can actually read, and you'll really get a lot out of it. I was born in camp, and yet still, it shined a light on the whole different aspects of life in camp that are completely unique and unprecedented in any place. I can't even imagine lawyers in Auschwitz or Guantanamo. So this is so unique, and in a sense, it does show the balance between the Constitution that they tried to reach. They couldn't do it, and they failed, and they violated the Constitution. But it was certainly an interesting experiment and a human experiment. And that's the part of the book that I thought was really the most compelling for me, was looking through the humanity in each of those individuals and the moral dilemmas they were facing. And I kept asking myself, wow, what would you do? What would you say? How far would you go? It was something that, these are questions that would not get raised in any other context except in as unique to the Japanese American concentration camps. And I felt that that's what made that book so compelling and so interesting. So thank you very much for doing it. I appreciate it.
So I appreciate the kind word and the plug there for the book. But I'm in the rare position of feeling that I need to speak up on behalf of dry, boring law professor books. Something I don't typically like to do. So thanks, everybody.
Can we have another round of applause for Mia and Eric? The book is available for sale out in the lobby. We have this book here. If you want to buy any of Eric's other books, they're available in the JANM store on the other side of the pavilion. Please visit our exhibitions as well while you're here. And we'll be doing a signing out in the lobby as well. So with that, thank you so much, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.